We are going to meet for one last time as the last class in Spirazman. Thank you everyone who made it, and you everyone who could make it even with the time change. I'm glad that you could accommodate it so Rabba Wendy could teach tonight. And to those out there on Facebook and on as well, good evening. This is I Have Left Here Full and Returned Empty, Loss and Recovery in the Book of Ruth with Rabba Wendy Amsellem. Rabba Wendy is a teacher of Talmud and Halacha at Yeshivat Maharat, and she is also a frequent teacher at Drisha. And we're always glad to have her back for this class, which is the third in a series of 3 sessions. During class, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to ask in chat. And if you're a panelist, you can unmute yourself. I will be posting sources in chat, in the sources for this class in chat shortly once Wendy gets things underway. And I will also send out another round of invitations to panelists if you're able to take it. I really recommend you do. And if you want me to make you a panelist or relay a question to Wendy, I'm very happy to do that. And with that, I want to pass things over to her.
Okay, great. So one of the very fun things about learning Megillat Ruth for these 3 Wednesdays is that I believe that in just about next week plus 1 day, we'll be reading Megillat Ruth, right? Next Wednesday will already be the first day of Shavuot. In Israel, we'll be reading Megillat Ruth 2 weeks ago today, and next week today. For the rest of us in Chutzlaretz, we'll be reading it on Thursday morning. But it's really great to sort of study the Megillah and know that we're about to read it also as a community. So if you remember last week, we left off at the very end of Perek Bet. Ruth had sort of struck up a relationship of sorts with Boaz, right? He had been very kind to her. He told her that he knew her story, that he knew all of the kindness that she had done for her mother-in-law. He gave her the bracha that God would reward her for all of the things that she had done. Ruth was very taken with this. He also shared some food with her, and told her to kind of keep coming back to glean in his fields with his na'arot, with his maidservants. Ruth reported all this back to Naomi, but she actually didn't report it as he told me to stay with his maidservants. She reported it as he told me to stay with his na'arim, with his male servants. And Naomi, though, understood. She says, oh, yes, you are right. You should stay with his maidservants, and that way you won't be harassed in any other fields. And at the end of the parak, we were told that, in fact, Ruth does this. And the very last verse was, "Vatidbak b'na'arot Boaz lelaket ad kolot kitzir ha'seorim u'kitzir ha'kitim." She remains with the maidservants of Boaz, gleaning after them throughout the harvest of the barley and of the wheat. And at the very end, "Vateshev et chamota." That's where we left her off. Right. So basically, they've, she's gathered in food. The harvest has ended. She kind of doesn't have any more business to do with Boaz and his field. So she comes home, and that's where we're going to pick up today. And if anybody does not yet have the sources, I think Kayla can send them to you or can share them. But I'm starting over here at the top of the page, source number 1. So we're in chapter 3. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi saying to Ruth, "Biti halo avakesh lach manoach asher yitav lach." She says to her, "My daughter, I'm looking for a resting place for you that will be good for you." Now, if we were just opening the book to chapter 3, we might not know what Naomi means by a resting place, right? Is she looking for some sort of house in the country for Ruth, right? What does she mean by this? But because we've been reading the book all along, and we remember that in the first chapter of Megillat Ruth, what Naomi had said to Ruth and Orpah when she was encouraging them to go back. Remember, she had said, "Shov na lech na, go back, return each woman to her mother's home." And then she had added on in verse 9 in chapter 1, "Yitain Hashem lachem," may God give you that mitzena menucha isha beit isha, you will find a resting place, each woman in her husband's home. Right. So for Naomi, what a menucha means is a husband, right? A place with a husband where the wife can sort of find respite and sort of feel settled in at home. And so as soon as we hear Naomi say to Ruth now, "Halo avakesh lach manoach," we kind of know what she means, right? What she means by this is, I'm going to try to find you a husband. I think that will be the way that I will, give you rest, give you a feeling of being settled. And you'll notice Ruth does not mention anything at all about looking for a manoach or for a husband, but this is Naomi's idea. And this is her plan. She says to Ruth in verse 2, Vata halo Boaz modatanu asher hayitet narotav. Boaz, our kinsman, the one who you were with, his girls, his maidservant, hinehu zoreh et goren hasaorim halayla. He is going to be winnowing his barley at in his storehouse tonight, right? So Naomi either has sort of asked around to get this information, or this might be the text's way of letting us know that Naomi is sort of more integrated into the community now, right? Remember when she first came, it seemed that she was very isolated. She said, don't even call me Naomi, just call me Mara. She felt like she had no hope. But now it seems like she knows what's going on, right? She has some information about what's going on in town. She knows that Boaz will be winnowing his barley that night, and she has a plan. She tells Ruth in verse 3, this is what you should do. You should bathe, you should anoint yourself with oil, you should get dressed in your nice clothing. Go down to the granary. But don't tell him that you are there. Don't let him know that you're there until he's done with his meal, until he's done eating and drinking. And at the point that you see him go to sleep, you look out, take note of where he's going to sleep. And come to where he is sleeping, uncover his legs, and lie there. And he'll tell you what to do. Now, this is quite a plan, right? Ruth, go bathe, anoint yourself, get dressed, sneak out to the granary, pay attention to where Boaz is, and once you see him fall asleep, go uncover his legs and lie there. What do we think? What is Naomi's plan? What's her goal? What does she want to have happen? Yeah, Sandra, what do you think?
Well, she's forcing Boaz's hand and also thrusting her daughter-in-law in his path in a non-work manner by putting her every day while they were working. It may have added to the familiarity of their faces to one another. This is more direct and more personal and more one-on-one.
Okay, so I totally agree, right? She wants Boaz and Ruth to meet up in a non-work situation, right? She wants Boaz to see Ruth in a different way. But in theory, right, Ruth could have just come knocking on the door while he's winnowing his barley, and that might have been enough, right? It seems very particular, right? Bathe, anoint yourself, don't tell him that you're there till he's asleep, then lie down at his feet, right? It seems like she's aiming for something that is more than just like having them meet up, right, outside of the regular situation, right? So I guess I'm just curious, like, right, what is success for Naomi, right? What does she think is going to happen?
Doesn't she want them to marry? In other words, for Boaz to so to speak, redeem them, so they can marry, and then he'll be the man of the house, and and his wealth, etc., will support them, and he can. I guess that means he gets their fields. I don't know how that the inheritance works.
Yeah, so that's great. So we can talk more specifically about the inheritance when we get to chapter 4, where they talk about that. But I totally agree with you, Joyce, right? It seems like her plan, right? She's looking for a manoach. She's looking for a resting place, which for Naomi means a husband. For Ruth, she's hoping that will happen. But like in terms of like specifically on this night, right? She probably doesn't think that Boaz is going to marry her that night alone in that, right? Because we need witnesses and so forth for the wedding. So like, what is her goal, right? Why is she instructing Ruth in this particular way? Yeah, Sandra.
Okay, so the way it's so filled with verbs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are at least 7, maybe 8 verbs, and what she's doing is she's basically planning a seduction, because we're looking at seduction thing. Anoint yourself, put on your Shabbos dress, take off your everyday clothing, wash your body, smell good, be good, uncover his feet. I mean, these are things that are audacious things for a Moabite, an ex-Moabite, who's trying to insinuate herself into the Judean culture to do, and to do it at night. And later she'll talk about balat, which means in silence, tiptoe, tiptoe, tiptoe. And also it's a place of danger. It seems that Ruth is just Ruth either at Naomi's behest or at her own direction, she puts herself in danger either at or Naomi or at Naomi's request. So she did it on the road when they were leaving Moab. These ladies were in grave danger. The derech is always a place of danger. And here, to go down to the Goren, to the place where maybe only prostitutes go, to do that, I think she's instructing in so many words that Ruth has to act like a Moabite, not like a Jewess. This is how I read it, like a seduction.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think that definitely makes sense, right? It certainly seems like the kinds of actions involved seem to be aiming towards a seduction, right? That's why she's bathing. That's why she's anointing herself. That's why she's there in the middle of the night. And it could be, right? It could be that maybe, you know, what Naomi is hoping for is that like Boaz and Ruth will sleep together, and then Boaz will feel sort of responsible then for like taking care of Ruth, right? That might be what's going on, right? We could certainly read it that way. One thing that's also worth noticing is that if you look in Pasuk Gimel and Pasuk Daled, you'll notice that there's a Kri and a Ketiv, right? We read it as V'yaradet Goren, right? You Ruth should go down to the Goren, but it's written as V'yaradeti, right? I will go down. And later on, later on it says V'shachaft, right? You Ruth will lie there. But we read it, we read it as V'shachaft, but it's written as V'shachafti, I will lie there. Aviva Zornberg sees the Korean Ketiv here as like indicating something about maybe like Naomi's own desires, right? She really wishes it were her, right? She wishes that she was the person who was going there, right? She was the person going down. She was the person lying there. But it's not, it's Ruth. But, you know, we can kind of get a glimpse of like maybe Naomi's own kind of sort of concealed desires. And certainly, you know, by the middle of the parak, we start to understand that there is a sort of generational gap between Boaz and Ruth, right? Later on, he's going to thank her for not going with the younger men, instead coming to him. So it seems as if perhaps Naomi and Boaz are sort of aligned in a generational way, and Ruth is younger. And so maybe Naomi does sort of wish on some level that she was the person who is involved here. But I think that, you know, it's certainly possible that what Naomi is hoping for is some sort of sexual encounter between Ruth and Boaz. But I think the detail that feels most striking to me is that she wants Ruth to wait until Boaz is asleep. And if it was just about a seduction, right, then she doesn't have to wait till Boaz is asleep, right? She could just show up when he's alone there, you know, and she's there and she's, you know, all freshly bathed and anointed with oil, and they could share wine and a meal, and you know, maybe that would be the way the seduction would go. But Naomi specifically wants her to wait until Boaz is sleeping. And I think that detail matters because I think, well, at least one way to read Boaz is that Boaz is a person who kind of very much wants to follow rules and like wants to do things properly, right? We'll see it in chapter 4. He like wants everything to be very above board. But as a result, it kind of sometimes keeps him from acting, right? He knew, if you remember at the beginning of chapter 2, he knows that Ruth and Naomi are back, right? Because as soon as the Na'ar identifies Ruth as the Na'ara Moaviyat, he knows the whole story, right? He says, oh, I've heard all about you. I've heard what you've done for your mother-in-law and so forth. So he knows that they've come back. He's their relative, but he kind of doesn't reach out to them at the beginning of chapter 2. And I think here as well, Naomi knows that, you know, Boaz in theory could be the redeemer for the family, but that Boaz is so sort of like buttoned up, he's not going to sort of act of his own accord. And so I think she specifically wants Ruth to be there once Boaz is asleep, because she's hoping that when Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night, or when he wakes up from his sleep, he'll have like less of his inhibitions there, and maybe that will kind of move him to do things that he would not be able to do if he was in his like fully awake, kind of totally controlled mode. That's my theory, right? Because it seems very interesting that she specifically wants Ruth to wait until Boaz is sleeping, and then to kind of just lie there. I think it's a way of, she wants to be able to get to Boaz before he has, you know, his full kind of general, regular sense of self about him. Okay, so sure enough, Ruth, upon hearing these instructions, she doesn't say, wait, this sounds like a really weird thing to do, Naomi. What are you asking me to do? Instead, in verse 5, she says, I will do whatever you tell me. And I think what's interesting to me about that verse is that it doesn't seem as if Ruth has been like on a hunt for a partner for herself, right? She's not scanning the fields trying to figure out who her next husband will be. She seems really very happy to be with Naomi. And if Naomi wants her to do something, she will follow Naomi's instructions. But it seems like she's doing it just out of loyalty to Naomi, not because she's like particularly interested in one outcome or another. And we can see that because she doesn't say to Naomi, hey, like, what's your plan? Like, what do you think is going to happen? What do you know? She doesn't offer any sort of feedback on it. She just says, okay, if you're asking me to do this, I will do whatever you tell me. So sure enough, in verse 6, we're told by Teret Hagoren, she goes down to the granary. She does exactly what her mother-in-law told her to do. In verse 7, we're told that Boaz eats. He drinks. Vayitavli bo. His heart is in a good, right? His heart is, he's feeling good. He's eaten and he's drunk. Vayavo lishkav biktzei arma. He goes to sleep kind of at the side of the pile of barley. And we're told exactly as Sandra said, Vatavo balat. She comes very stealthily, very quietly. Vatigal margalotav. She uncovers his feet, Vatishkav, and she lies there. She doesn't touch him. She doesn't say anything. She just lies there. And I think, again, the goal is going to be to have him wake up. And in this moment, before he's kind of fully aware of what's going on, to sort of encourage something that he might not be willing to say, you know, in a regular daylight conversation. So she is lying there. We're told, it's the middle of the night. And then suddenly he senses that somebody's there. He like trembles and sort of shakes. And then we're told, lo and behold, there is a woman lying there at his feet, right? Very shocking. When he went to sleep, he thought he was all by himself, ate, drank, he was feeling really good. He goes to sleep, and now suddenly there is a woman there at his feet. And so the first thing you can think of to say to her is, Mihat, who are you, right? Who are you? Who's here with me? What's going on? And I think it's clear that the person who's there with him is not threatening him, right? Because if he's, you know, the person is sort of sleeping, lying at his feet, they're not, right? There's no sense that he's going to feel like he needs to defend himself, right? She's not next to him in a way that's threatening at all. He just wants to know who she is. And she responds and she says, Anochi Ruth amatecha. Now, if you remember, Boaz has once before asked who she is, right? Remember back at the beginning of Perek Bet when he first saw her, he said, Lemiha na'ara hazod, right? To whom does this girl belong, right? And I was saying last week, I think that's one of the central questions of Megillat Ruth, right? To whom does Ruth belong? Who is her community? Who is her family? Here, though, he doesn't say, who do you belong to? He just says, who are you? Mi'at. And her response is, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Ufarasta knafecha alamatcha ki goelata. You should spread your cloak over your handmaiden because you are the Redeemer. Now, this also is a very clever kind of response to something that Boaz told her. If you remember back in Perek Bet, when Boaz was offering her those brachot, he said, I've heard about how good you were to your mother-in-law, all the chesed that you did for her, also how you left your mother and your father, the land of your birth, you came to this place that you don't know. And then he's basically said, you know, may God fully reward you for what you've done. And in verse 12 in chapter 2, he says to her, may your reward be sort of fully repaid from God, the Lord of Israel, under whose wings or under whose cloak you have come to find protection. Right? So he basically said, you know, you've come to sort of be sheltered under God's cloak, and may God fully reward you for that. And she's saying to him here, actually, that's great. Like, I'm glad, you know, you gave me that bracha about God, but actually, Boaz, you yourself can do something more active, right? Don't just give me brachot. You actually are in the position of being the redeemer for this family. So I don't just want to be under God's cloak, right? Actually, you should spread your cloak, right? So she's being sort of very direct here. And it's interesting because we haven't heard Naomi give her those instructions, right? Naomi just said, you go there and he'll tell you what to do, right? But we get the sense here that Ruth is pretty clever, right? She kind of figures out what's going on. She figures out what the thing is to say. And also, I think she realizes about Boaz that he's not going to figure it out on his own, right? If she just waits for him to tell her what to do, right, nothing may happen. So she's very clear. She says, I am Ruth. Not only am I Ruth, but actually, I can tell you who I am, but I can also tell you who you are. You, Boaz, are actually the redeemer for our family, and you should do something about it. And Boaz's response, instead of being taken aback, Boaz's response in verse 10 is to be extremely grateful, right? He says to her, he says to her, blessed are you before God. What you're doing right now, this act of chesed that you're doing right now, is actually even greater than your first act of chesed. Now, what do we think the first act of chesed was?
Following Naomi,
Right.
or in the field. But I think the chesed has to do with the death and all that. And it's got to be following Naomi.
Yeah, so it's a good question, right? Now, if you remember, when he initially tells her that he knows who she is back in Perek Bet, he says, "Huged hugadli kol asher asit et chamotecha acharid motishech." He doesn't use the word chesed there, right? He just says, I've heard about all of the things that you've done for your mother-in-law. So it could make sense. I agree with Sandra. It could make sense that the chesdech harishon could be your first act of chesed was coming with your mother-in-law in order to protect her. Your second act of chesed is coming here tonight. Or the other thing might be, your first act of chesed was coming here, and your second act of chesed is telling me the things that I need to be told, right? So I think you could read it probably either way. He says, but either way, this act of chesed, what you're doing right now is even better than any act of chesed you did before. And what are you doing right now that's so good? Right? You're not going with the younger men, you've come to me. And this is kind of really the first evidence that we have in Megillat Ruth that there's this generational divide between Boaz and Ruth, right? We actually haven't been told kind of anything about the relative ages of the people, right? We just know that Boaz is a man of wealth, a man of substance. We know that Ruth had been married for 10 years, but we don't really have any sense of like their ages in respect to one another. But suddenly over here, when we're told, oh, I would have expected you to go for the younger men and you've come here to me instead, we get the sense that Boaz is older and Ruth is younger, and that he sees her choosing of him as also an act of chesed of some sorts. Gilana, did you say you had a question?
Yeah, so in verse 9, Ruth calls herself a handmaid, amatecha, and I was wondering what the relationship is between that word and I think it's shifchotecha from chapter 2 that we had talked about, that verse, verse 13 in chapter 2, where she's talking to Boaz and says, speak, gently to your maidservant, but then she says, I'm not one of your.
Exactly, right. And there, exactly, you're right. She used the word shivcha there, right? She says, "Vanochi lo eyakecha shivchotecha." So it's a good question. I mean, I think that generally in Tanakh, they're used somewhat interchangeably, aman, shivcha, like an amavria, shivcha. I think they're used somewhat interchangeably. It's possible within a given story, one could sort of try to tease out a meaning of one or the other, but like, for example, Hagar is referred to as both a shivcha, right? La shivcha means to shema Hagar, but she's also called an amma in terms of like ben ha'ama. So I think they're kind of used somewhat interchangeably, but I'm not sure. Like it might be that they're, Sandra, please.
I think maybe there might be just a small wink, a tiny wink with the use of the amma, the word amma, because if in the oral tradition of Torah, as opposed to being read, it was being spoken out loud or read out loud, and so people heard it. So oral, A-U-R-A-L, as oral, O-R-A. So Amma and Ima are at least similar sounding, and so to call herself Amatecha, it's just a wink, even though she's unwittingly saying it. She's going to be she's going to be the mother of his son. She's going to be the mother of a line of kings, and so it's a tiny wink, maybe not intended, certainly not intended by the speaker, but maybe intended in a passive way by the author.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great, like it's just as a homophone, right? Ima,
yeah,
nama.
a homophone, great. Exactly.
Could
I ask a question? In
Please.
Terms of ages, I always thought that if we had a family tree, we'd see that Naomi's father and Boaz's father, I think, were brothers, so that makes them first cousins. So I never thought, or Elimelech's brothers. So I had made a family tree a couple of weeks back to see where it goes. So in my mind, he was always the generation of Elimelech and Ruth. I mean, it's romantic to think of him as studly and gorgeous and her age, but it was always in my mind that he wasn't. He was always of Naomi and Elimelech's age.
Yeah, so the midrashim definitely, the midrashim create like a whole kind of backstory, family relationship. They have Naomi and Elimelech themselves being relatives, and Boaz
Right.
is also a relative, and so
Cousin.
that definitely exists. But in the psukim themselves, right, all we know is that Elimelech has a cousin named Boaz, right? That's all we knew about Boaz when we
Right,
met him,
cousin.
right?
So he
Naomi
could be
modali isha.
Okay.
And right, cousins could be, it's hard to do,
Yep,
right?
yep,
It's
yep.
hard to know either way. You know, the midrashim also imagine that like Boaz's wife has just died, and they create a whole backstory. But in the verses, we just see that Boaz seems to be somewhat unattached, and then he marries Ruth. And I think really kind of the only point that we really have any sense of an age difference is over here, where he seems very grateful to her that she chose him instead of running off with the younger men.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so
Can I ask a quick question?
please, of course.
This never struck me as strange, but tonight while we're reading this, I'm kind of struck that like, why is he sleeping outside? Like, it seems like he's sleeping outside.
So I think he's sleeping. I think my understanding of it is that he is winnowing his barley on the threshing floor, and that he's sort of sleeping there to kind of guard it afterwards.
That's right. That's right.
It seems like, yeah, it seems like it's not that he doesn't have a different home to go to, but I think that maybe like once you've winnowed it, you know, then it is, I guess, valuable, and maybe he's guarding it, or maybe he's just tired and he's already there. It seems as if as soon as Naomi knows that he's threshing his barley, she knows he's going to be sleeping there that night. So my guess is that that was sort of standard practice. I don't know enough about farming to know why that would be standard practice, but it seems like it was understood that if he was going to be winnowing it tonight, that meant he would be staying there. I don't even know what a good analog would be. Something today that we would do.
It was probably a significant distance to go, you know, to like commute back and forth. You're going to be all day.
Yeah, and you'd want to finish
dark,
it up, and
so you just sleep there. You don't. And I've heard separately more. I mean, the conservative movement, like for Sukkot, they were emphasizing that people, not just the Sukkot, like in during the 40 years in the desert, but when the Israelites were in Israel, they built a Sukkah like to be near the fields. You know, even like the house may have been a bit of a distance, so they had a sukkah there, and that's how they did the work in the field. They would sleep in the sukkah at least intermittently. So it's like I don't know the geographical setup, but if you were, you know, a half an hour walk from your field, so it was nicer just to sleep there in some, you know, the building wherever you did the threat.
Right, and my guess is also that once you thresh, my guess is that once you thresh the barley, it's like, you know, it's easier to steal it, right? Like if it's still in the stalks, you'd have to like carry a lot of it. But like once you thresh it, then it probably becomes more tempting to a potential thief, right? Because it's now small and you could, so maybe that's another reason. Yeah, please, Sandra, sorry.
I mean, we have to remember that it's the Zman Shefot HaShoftim. I mean, it's a wild west of a place. I mean, that's the setting of this lovely story, is in a very dark and dangerous wild west place. And so, yes, all the things, the distance was great to go back and forth and all this, but basically you slept by a winnowed grain pile to make sure that it was there the next morning. And that was why they slept by their grain piles, every man by his grain pile. And it was a very male thing, and it was a dangerous place, but that's why they slept there at night. That's why they slept outside, and that's why they were watching over their grain, because especially after 10 years of a famine, this is the most precious thing, which is a bumper harvest, the barley, and then the wheat. This is a huge big deal.
Right. Although you wonder kind of how good a guard of his stuff Boaz would be, given that he does not hear Ruth come over and he does not feel her like coming to his legs. So, but whatever. One would hope that maybe he would hear it if he came to take the barley. Okay. At any rate, so he then says to her in verse 11, "Vatabiti altiri kol asher tomri e'eselach." He says to her, "My daughter, do not worry. Whatever you tell me to do, I will do." Which is also an interesting reversal, because if you remember, Naomi had said to Ruth, he'll tell you what to do. And now Boaz says, actually, I'll do whatever you tell me, right? You tell me what you want me to do. I'll do whatever you say. Because actually everyone knows that you are an Eshet Chayil. Now, what an Eshet Chayil means is an interesting question. If you remember when we first met Boaz in in chapter 2, the very first verse of chapter 2 was Naomi has a relative, Ish Gibor Chayil, Mimishpachat Elimelech. Right? She has a relative, Boaz, who's known as an Ish Gibor Chayil. And now he says, actually, we all know about you that you are an Eshet Chayil, right? Now, an Eshet Chayil, probably, right, usually people understand Ish Gibor Chayil as like a man of substance, as a wealthy man. That obviously does not mean that about Ruth, right? Eshet Chayil doesn't mean a wealthy woman, because she is certainly not wealthy, but it seems to mean a very good person, right? Everybody knows that you are a good person, a person of integrity. We all know how wonderful you are. And I think that is a really big moment, right? Because if you remember in chapter 1, when Ruth first showed up, nobody even noticed her, right? Everybody said, oh, is this Naomi? Naomi said, oh, I left here full. I came back empty. I have no one. And everybody kind of doesn't pay attention to Ruth. Beginning of chapter 2, she shows up. She's leaning. When Boaz says, who is that? His servant says, ah, just some Moabite girl. She came back with Naomi. Like, I don't really know what she's doing here, right? But it seems like in the course, in the time between the beginning of the harvest and now, the people of the community have gotten to know Ruth. And Boaz says, it's not just that, like, I think you're great, because as soon as I heard your story, I thought you were wonderful, right? You left behind your mother and your father, and you've been so kind to your mother-in-law. But now he says, actually, everyone knows that you're a very good person, right? Yodea kol sha'ar ami. And if we remember that initial question that was asked, right, miha na'ara hazot, to whom does this girl belong? It seems like by this point in the story, the community has accepted her, right? She belongs to this community now. They all know that she's an Eshet Chayil, right? He says, basically, everybody knows that you are great. I will do whatever you ask me to. But you should know, in the next verse, Amnam ki goel anochi, v'gam yish goel karov mimeni. It is true that I am in the line of potential redeemers for your family, but actually, there is another person who's an even closer relative than I am. And then he says something very curious. In verse 13, he says, Lini halayla, sleep here tonight. V'haya boker imi galech tov yigal. And if at the morning the closer relative wants to redeem you, that's all well and good, right? That can happen. But if he does not want to redeem you, right? Then by God, I will redeem you. Lie here until the morning. So the first question that we have is, why does he want her to lie there until the morning? What do you guys think?
Wandering
safety.
around in the middle of the night between whoever was out there trying to steal somebody's grain might not be the person she should run into, and maybe they're animal, maybe they're wild animals.
Okay, right. So it could be he says, stay here tonight because he wants to protect her, right? Although I guess in theory, like he could walk her home, right? Like not unthinkable. I mean, maybe it's dangerous for both of them. That could be, right? Maybe it's dangerous for everybody. And so he says, stay here tonight because that way it'll be safer. He could have walked her home, but and maybe that would have been okay, or maybe it wouldn't have been. I think it might be that it's a matter of safety, but I think there's also a sense that he wants her there, right? He really wants to be with her. And he's so committed to doing the right thing that he knows that he has to give the other redeemer the chance to marry Ruth instead, right? And so he knows he's going to do that, right? He's going to give the other Goel that option. If that person does, Tov, right? Then that's good. That's the way it should be, right? Boaz is a person who who does things by the book, right? If the other person is first in line to redeem, we have to give him that option. If that happens, right, Ruth will be married to this other person forever. But Boaz, I think, kind of wants a little more time with her, right? He likes having her there. He wants her to stay there, right? And it doesn't seem as if there's any sort of other physical contact, right? We're told in the next verse, "Vatishkav margelotav b'boker," she sort of stays there at his feet. But I think he doesn't want her to leave just yet, right? I think it might be for her safety, but I think there's also a sense that he kind of wants her to be there. And I think that's what Naomi was banking on, right? Naomi was banking on the fact that if Boaz found himself alone with Ruth, he would feel something towards her, right? He would feel something, and that would sort of motivate him, right? He's going to make things happen. And because he's a person who does things properly, right? He's not going to right now kind of propose marriage to her if there's another person who's like the next person in line to redeem the family. But he is kind of going to be inspired to sort of get to a place of resolution. And we get a sense that he has a preference, right? It might have just been, right, if he didn't say, Lini halayla, we might have thought like, oh, maybe, you know, he's just so impressed with her. He thinks she's really great and he himself wants to do his duty. And so he's going to make sure that like either this other guy marries her or he does, because it's totally just from a sense of like, you know, I want to do the things that are supposed to happen. The moment he says to her, like, rest here tonight, sleep here until the morning, I think we get the sense that even though in the end, he will, you know, kind of concede to whatever the proper set of rules are, he has a stake in it, right? He would like for it to work out, that he and Ruth will be together. And I think we feel that because he's not ready to say goodbye to her yet, right? He wants her to stay there until the morning. She wakes up before it gets light, right? But before it's light enough for one person to recognize their fellow. People who have studied the Mishnayot of Brachot know that this is a very important pasuk, right? When it is light enough for one person to recognize another, that's when you can recite Kriyat Shema and so forth, right? This is kind of a dividing line between night and day, right? It's clear enough that you can recognize your friend. That means it's already light out. She gets up before you can recognize your friend. And he says, I don't want anyone to know that she was here, right? He has a sense of propriety that I think we get the sense that Ruth doesn't have, right? She doesn't seem to be aware of the fact that it would be like sort of scandalous if she walked out of the Goren in the morning in broad daylight, right? She's just kind of doing whatever Naomi told her to. Naomi told her to go there. She thinks it's a fine thing to do. She stays there all night. But Boaz, who has like a little bit more of a sense of sort of the way the world works, he says, you know, it would be better if people did not see Ruth leaving here in the middle of the night. That reminds me a little bit also of how he says to her, it's better for you to hang out with my maidservants. And like for her, like that doesn't kind of code one way or the other. Like, you know, Narim, Narot, they're kind of both the same to her. But Boaz and Naomi have more of a sense of propriety. And so Boaz says, better for nobody to know that she was here. But before she leaves, he says to her, right? Hold out the kerchief that's upon you. And he measures out six measures of barley into her scarf. And then she brings that back to town, right? From the field back to the town, back to her mother-in-law. Why do you think he does that, right? Why does he give her this barley in the morning?
He's kind, and maybe he's almost wooing her a little bit.
Yeah, right. He's giving her some sort of present. Now, in theory, she's collected a lot of other wheat and barley from his fields because she's been there all season, but he wants to give her something else. And I think you're right, Joyce. I think he wants to demonstrate his generosity in that moment, right? He wants her to know that he's looking out for her, right? So she's been there and he wants to let her know that like he cares about her. And the way that he does that is by giving her this gift. And it's not a gift because she needs it, right? It's not that they, right? Presumably she's gathered up food. She's not reliant on these 6 measures of barley. He's giving her a gift because he wants her to know that he cares about her and that he's kind of serious about what is going to come. Yeah.
Because the harvest is over, she can't glean anymore. Like she can't go back and take more stalks that were dropped. So maybe this has to last until like next spring. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's other crops that she could glean from.
Oh, I was assuming that she was gathering things up to like last. You know, she's
right.
Like
well,
in
we
the
don't
same
know,
way that
we
all
don't
the
know how much was dropped, and she wasn't the only one gleaning. I mean, I have no idea.
Yeah,
and I don't know how much barley you need. Like, you know,
yeah.
I don't live on a farm either.
Yeah, it's
I
true.
go to the supermarket. I buy what I want.
It does seem like as if if you remember, he instructed his reapers to like let extra stalks fall for her. So I imagine that she's been doing, you know, she's been gathering a lot, but maybe right, it's always good to have more food, especially people who've come out of a famine. As Sandra reminded us, right? People who've come out of a famine are always going to be especially concerned about food. So he gives her this food, but I get the sense that it's a gift, not in the sense of I want to make sure you have lunch today. It's a gift of like, I want to show you that I'm serious about this, right? I want to show you that I care about you and that I'm serious about this. She takes the barley home. She gets to her mother-in-law. And for the second time in the past couple of hours, somebody asks her, Miat, who are you? Right? If you remember in the middle of the night, Boaz said to her, Miat, who are you? And she said, Anochi Udavka. Now her mother-in-law says, Miat Biti, who are you? Now, obviously Naomi knows who she is, right? She's not asking because she woke up in the middle of the night and she's confused. She's asking like, what's happened, right? Are you the same person? Has your status changed, right? What's going on? And so Ruth tells her everything that happened. And then Ruth, with a flourish, produces the 6 measures of barley. And she says, right? Actually, Boaz gave me these 6 measures of barley because he said, don't come back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Now, I kind of love this moment in the story, right? It's possible maybe Boaz really did say that and the Megillah just didn't bother telling us, but I don't think he did, right? I think he gave her the barley because he's showing her that he's serious about this. But in Naomi's mind, in Ruth's mind, she's so much always thinking about Naomi that she can't imagine that a gift for her isn't a gift for Naomi. In the same way that when Boaz gave her lunch on that first day, she saved some of her lunch very naturally to bring to Naomi. Here as well, she just assumes that if he's giving her this barley, it must be also for Naomi, right? It must be that this is the gift that is for her. When Naomi sees this very generous gift, she realizes that Boaz is serious, right? Which I think again is the point of the gift. And she says to Ruth, "Shvi biti ad asher tidin ech yipola davar," right? You wait here till we see how this will end. Ki lo yishkot ha'ish ki im kila hadavar hayom. The man will not rest until the matter is resolved today. And I think this again lets us know what Naomi's real plan was, right? She wants to light a fire under Boaz, right? She wants to get Boaz to do something. She can tell that Boaz is very restrained. He wants to do things by the book. He doesn't want to do anything untoward. She sends Ruth there in the middle of the night because she wants to sort of awaken something in Boaz. And I think she does, right? It doesn't seem as if anything kind of inappropriate has happened between them, at least based on these verses, but it does seem as if Boaz feels something strong, right? He wants Ruth to stay there during the night. He wants her to be with him. And he is not going to go so far as to abrogate the proper, order of things, but he's going to make sure that there's a resolution today. Now, before we see chapter 4, where the resolution happens, we have to stop for a moment and think about what are the problems involved here, right? It is true that there's a closer redeemer, but there's another kind of bigger problem, and that's something that the Talmud fleshes out, which is we know that Ruth is a Moabite, right? And even though she has declared that she wants to be with Naomi, she wants Naomi's people to be her people, she wants Naomi's God to be her God, we know, though, that everybody still knows about Ruth that she is from Moab. And we also know, if you look at source number 2, that the Torah is quite clear on marriages between the people of Israel and the people of Moab, right? We're told here, Lo yavo Amoni Moavi bikal Hashem, gam dor asiri lo yavo lehem bikal Hashem ad olam. No person from the nation of Ammon and Moab can be admitted into the congregation of God, even to the 10th generation. And the reason that's given is, why are we not allowed to marry people from Ammon and Moab? Because when we were leaving Egypt and we were hungry and thirsty, they didn't come out to greet us with bread and water, right? We'd been enslaved for hundreds of years. We finally got our freedom. They were our cousins, right? Ammon and Moab are the descendants of Lot, Avram's nephew. They're our cousins, and yet they don't come out to greet us. And because of this extreme lack of hospitality, therefore the Torah says we cannot marry them. If you remember from the end of Sefer Bamidbar, it's not just that they don't greet us with bread and water, they actually threaten to attack us if we come near their land. So even more inhospitable than lack of bread and water. So we know that in general, people from Israel are not supposed to marry people from Moab. And yet it seems as if Boaz is poised to either have another person from Israel marry Ruth, or to he himself marry Ruth. And if you look at source number 3, this is in Masechet Yevamot, it seems as if even the Talmud imagines that even several generations after Ruth lived, the question of whether or not she could marry a person from Israel was still a very live question. And this is a sort of a delightful passage of Yevamot. It imagines, right, the action over here is imagined as happening at the time of the battle between David and Goliath, right? So David is going out to fight Goliath, and Shaul, who's the king at the time, is like, wait a minute, like, what's going on? Who is this guy who's like going out to fight Goliath? He starts to sort of have suspicions that maybe David is really kind of angling to be the next king. And with him at the moment are 2 other people, his chief advisor, Doeg HaEdomi, and his general, Avner. So Doeg, who, by the way, in the actual psukim, I think is referred to as the shepherd of Shaul, but he's imagined by the rabbis to be like a very wise man and a learned man, and who eventually goes bad, but at this point he's still just a wise and learned man who's an advisor. So Doeg says to Shaul over here in source number 3, before you start wondering whether or not David is sort of fit to be the next king or not, you should actually first think, can he even marry a Jewish person? Now, this is a very relevant question for Shaul, because Shaul has promised that whoever defeats Goliath will get to marry Shaul's daughter. But if David is not of like lineage that can marry a Jewish person, right, this would be problematic. So Doeg says, even before you start thinking about whether or not David could be king, you have to first worry about, is he even fit to marry into the Jewish people? So Shaul says, my Tama, right? Why would he not be fit to marry into the Jewish people? And the response that Doeg gives is, because David is descended from Ruth, who is a Moabite. So Avner, the general, who's of course also very learned, says, what are you talking about? We've learned Ammoni velo Ammonit, Moavi velo Moavit. We have learned that when the verse says Lo yavo Ammoni Moavi bekahal Hashem, that only refers to the men of Ammon and the men of Moab, but the women of Ammon and the women of Moab can marry Jewish people, and therefore totally fine for Ruth to have married Boaz. Doeg says, oh yeah, really? Do you really read the verse as because it says Ammoni, it doesn't mean Ammonite, and because it says Moavi, it doesn't mean Moavit? What about the verse afterwards? It says that we can't marry Egyptians for 3 generations. Are we also going to say Mitri velo Mitri, that only applies to Egyptian men and not Egyptian women? Which is a good challenge. But Avner says, no, Shani hacha dimifaresh tama. It's different with Ammon and Moab because we know the reason, right? The next verse 5, tells us why it is that we're not supposed to marry people from Ammon and Moab. It's because al davar shelo kidmu etchem belechem u'mayim baderech, right? It's because they didn't bring you bread and water when you were traveling along the way. Darko shel ish lekadem velo darka shel isha lekadem. It's only the expectation is only that the men will greet strangers with bread and water and not the women. And so therefore the men of Moab and Ammon are faulted for not bringing Bnei Israel bread and water, but not the women, because there's no expectation that they would. And that's why there's no ban on marrying Moabite women, only Moabite men. That's fine. But Doeg says, well, that doesn't make so much sense. I understand that maybe we don't want women going out and offering bread and water to strange men, but the women could have offered bread and water to the other women, and the men should have offered bread and water to the other men. In other words, both the men and the women are culpable because they both could have offered bread and water and didn't. And so therefore, maybe it's not going to be allowed to marry Moabite women, in which case David's lineage is suspect, and he should not be allowed to marry somebody from Israel. Avner at that point is silent, right? Ishtik. He doesn't know what to say. Doeg has gotten the better of him. Shaul says to him, well, in that case, if the law has kind of gotten lost from you, they learned that the law has gotten lost from him because they refers to David as an Elem instead of a Na'ar. They're synonyms for boy, but up until now, David has been called a Na'ar, and now he's called an Elem. The Gemara says, oh, that means that Nital Ma Mincha, right? The law has kind of gotten hidden from you, right? You don't remember the law. Seyu Sha'al B'Beit midrash. Avner, I know we're in the middle of a war. I know we're here on the battlefield, but go to the Beit Midrash right now and ask the question, right? If you don't know the answer, you have to go find out. I like that image also, right? That the rabbis imagine that like nothing could be more pressing than a question of halakha that needs to be answered. So stop worrying about whatever's happening on the battlefield. Go ask in the Beit Midrash. Avner slips away to the Beit Midrash and they tell him, yes, in fact, Ammoni velo Ammonit, Moavi velo Moavit, right? The ban is on men of Ammon, not on women of Ammon, and the ban is on men of Moab and not on women of Moab. So the Gemara concludes that in fact it is okay for Jewish men to marry Moabite women, just not okay for Jewish women to marry Moabite men. But here, because Ruth herself is a Moabite woman, she is allowed to marry into the people. And it's interesting that the Book of Ruth never asks that question, right? The Book of Ruth sort of imagines that Ruth has been fully integrated into the community, right? Yodea kol sha'arami ki eshet chayalat. Everybody knows how wonderful Ruth is. The question is just which person is going to marry her, but the Book of Ruth doesn't present any problem with the marriage, but the rabbis do, right? They have to kind of figure out, like, how is it possible, given that we have this verse that says that, we're not supposed to intermarry with Moabites? How is it possible that Ruth is able to convert her? Okay, with that settled, we move on to chapter 4, right? Boaz, we're told in verse number 1, sees the Goel, he sees the closer redeemer passing by, and he says to him, Surah Shvapo, right? Come over, sit here. The text refers to him as Ploni Almoni, right? Ploni Almoni just basically means Mr. X, right? The text doesn't tell us his name. Come here, sit over here. And he does. And then in verse 2, Boaz gathers together 10 people from Ziknei Ha'ir, right? 10 of the city elders. You get the sense that Boaz wants things to be above board, right? He doesn't want anything sneaky. He wants everybody to be in on every part of this process. So he does it at the town sha'ar, at the town gate, which is the most public place. He has 10 of the city elders there because he wants everything to kind of be known to all of them. And then he says to the Goel, hey, you know, the field that belonged to our brother Elimelech, machran Naomi hashava misnei Moab. So I would read this as Naomi sold it, right? Naomi came back, she sold it, and now we, the family members, need to redeem it because the Torah is filled with descriptions of that. If a person becomes so poor that they have to sell their land, their family members are supposed to step in and redeem the field. Other people read it as she needs to sell it, and so, you know, we want to be the ones to buy it. So you can read machra as either she has sold it or she is planning to sell it. At any rate, he says to her, but we, the family members, need to buy this field. So will you buy this field? Let me know. And if not, then I will. And the man says, okay, I'll buy the field. Right? He says, Anochi Agael, the end of verse 4, I'll buy the field. And then Boaz says, oh, but just so you know, if you buy the field, you don't only get the field, right? Right? You have not only acquired the field, but you've also acquired the wife of the deceased, right? Ruth was married to Machlon. He, in theory, was was an heir to the field. If you buy the field, you don't only get the field, but you also have to marry the woman who's sort of connected to the estate. You have to marry Ruth in order to sort of keep alive the name of the deceased, with his inheritance. So buying the field entails also marrying Ruth. And at that point, the Redeemer says, wait, hold on. I can't really do that. He says, Lo uchali oli. In that case, I can't be the Redeemer. Pen ashchit et nachalati, lest I destroy my own inheritance. Ge'al lecha ata geulati. Right? You should be the Redeemer instead of me. Ki lo uchali go, because I cannot do it. So what does he really mean when he says, lest I destroy my inheritance? It's a great question, right? Some people think that he already has children, and by marrying Ruth and having more children, that would involve sort of dividing up his estate in a way that would be problematic. Other people think it's specifically because Ruth is a Moavia, right? Because he is not convinced that he's allowed to marry her, and maybe marrying her is going to sort of cast aspersions on all of his future descendants. We don't know exactly what he means by penashlit et nachalati, but we do know that he's quite clear that he does not want to marry her. And Boaz says, okay, in that case, I will do that. And in verse 9, he turns to the elders and to all the people, and he says to them, Edim atem hayom, right? You are my witnesses today. Ki kaniti et kol asher le'Elimelech v'et kol asher le'Chilion u'Machlon miyad Naomi. I am acquiring all of the property that belonged to Elimelech and his sons Machlon and Chilion. I'm acquiring it all from Naomi. And also I am acquiring, in verse 10, I am acquiring Ruth as a wife, in order to keep alive the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that his name will not die out. The people all agree. They say, Edim, yeah, we are witnesses to this fact. And now in verses 11 and 12, they give Ruth and Boaz a series of very beautiful blessings, right? They tell them, Ruth, may you be like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. And may your home be like the home of Peretz, who Tamar gave birth to with Yehudah, right? Basically, all of these important families, may your descendants be like them. I think the Tamar and Yehudah is a particularly apt thing for them to recall, because if you remember, Yehudah also experienced this tragedy of two sons dying, Er and Onan, and then kind of with Tamar was able to sort of rebuild his family. And we get the sense over here that Naomi has had the tragedy of her two sons, Machlon and Chilion, dying, and are saying, we hope though that there will be new children that will also carry on this family. And sure enough, in verse 13, right, Boaz and Ruth get married, and gives birth to a son. And what I really wanted us to end off with are the next three verses, 14, 15, and 16, because I think this is where things really kind of change in the book, right? The women who had appeared towards the end of chapter 1, they come back over here in verse 14. And when the baby is born, the women turn to Naomi and they say, Baruch Hashem shelo hishbit lach goel hayom. Blessed be God who has not kind of kept you from having a redeemer today, and let this baby's name be called out in Israel. Right? They said, Naomi, when you first came back, you thought that God was persecuting you. You thought that everything was bitter. You thought your name was Mara. But in fact, God has been with you all along, and God has made sure that you are going to have this redeemer. And this baby will sort of awaken your spirit and care for you in your old age. Right? And the reason why this baby is so important is not because you now have another male descendant, when you had none. The reason why this baby is so important is that your daughter-in-law, who loves you so much, she's the one who gave birth to this baby. And your daughter-in-law, she's the one who's actually even better for you than 7 sons, right? I think what they're saying to Naomi is, Naomi, you had a particular way of thinking about the world, right? You thought that the only thing that mattered was whether or not you had sons. And when your sons died, you thought you had nothing left to offer in the world. You thought you had nothing to look forward to. But in fact, and you thought that the fact that Ruth was with you was kind of no consequence, right? You said, Anim leah halachti ve'rekam heshivani Hashem, I've come back with nothing. But actually, you came back with Ruth, and Ruth cares about you so much and loves you so much. She's better for you than even 7 sons would be. Naomi takes the baby. She kind of becomes the nursemaid for the baby. And the women now all say in verse 17, Yulad ben the Naomi, right? They say, oh, it's like Naomi has had a child. And so I think there's a way in which at the end of the story, right, Naomi kind of, one aspect of the recovery for her is that, she loses her sons and now she has kind of a child that she cares for instead. But I think the women sort of say to her, it's not just that you now have this child, but also all along throughout the entire story, you've had Ruth. And maybe at first you didn't sort of fully appreciate what you had in Ruth, but you should appreciate it now, right? You should appreciate that Ruth has been with you for this entire time, and it's her love and her care for you that have kind of gotten you to this better place right now. The baby is like an extra nice bonus, but like really the thing that actually matters is Ruth, and it's her love for you that's kind of has been the ultimate redemption for you. And of course, the book then concludes with the different generations, right, that lead us from Peretz, who the people in the town kind of recall as part of their blessing. Peretz, the son of Tamar and Yehuda, right? So Peretz has a son named Chetzron. Chetzron has a son named Ram. Ram has a son named Aminadav. Aminadav has a son named Nachshon. Nachshon has a son named Salma. Salmon has a son named Boaz. Boaz is our hero over here. And Boaz and Ruth have a son named Oved. Oved's son is Yishai, and Yishai's son is David. And there's a sense that that David, right, is not just going to be kind of the great king of Israel that he is, but also we know that kind of the ultimate kingly line, the ultimate Mashiach also descends from David. And I think the book kind of ends on this note of hope in that manner, right? It begins in this very bleak, hopeless way with Naomi saying, I have nothing to offer you, my daughters-in-law, just leave me. God is persecuting me. I have nothing to look forward to. There's no way that anything can ever be better for me. And in the course of the book, she goes from being so dark and so sad to kind of, in the end, being able to sort of imagine a way out for herself and for Ruth, right? Naomi is the person who kind of sort of puts things in motion in chapter 3 that then kind of come to resolution in chapter 4. And I think the book kind of by ending with the birth of David kind of lets us know that it's not just that like the book is ending on a note of hope for this particular family, but I think it's ending on a note of hope for the people of Israel, right? There's a sense that with David's line comes kind of sort of an ultimate hope for redemption. And I think the book suggests that like the way to redemption is through sort of kindness and devotion, right? It's Ruth, because of her kindness, because of her love for Naomi, because of how dedicated she is to her, she's able together with Naomi to kind of bring about this moment of hope that we get to on the end. And I would just end by saying that, it's been a really bleak, dark, hopeless year for so many of us. And I hope that by reading Ruth, we're able to kind of also imagine for ourselves a time that is lighter and happier and full of redemption. So great to learn with you guys for the past 3 weeks. I hope if you have any thoughts as you think more about Megillat Ruth or as you read it on Shavuot, please email me. I put my email address on top of all of the source sheets, so it should be easy to find me. Thank you so much, and thank you for accommodating the time shift today also. I very much appreciate that.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Wendy.
you.
Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you very much, Rabba Wendy, for coming and teaching this class. It's been a lovely series, and it's always a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you.
There is one more class for Sfirazman in about a half hour at 7:30. And continuing in the summer, we have Mishnah in Depth Gittin with Leora Balinsky starting this Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And you can sign up at drisha.org/classes. And with that, and if anyone has any questions, they can always reach out to Drisha, and I'm happy to pass them along to Rabba Wendy. And with that,
Thank you so much.
have a good evening.
Thank
Take care. It was a great pleasure learning with you all.